I love hot sauce. Taco Bell. So today I wanted to talk about my conversion from the Mormon Church again. There's really a gold mine, no pun intended, of reasons to become estranged to this institution. Where to begin is probably the hardest question. Like every new institution, every new movement that there is always comes with its problems. I understand that. And I think I understand that a lot more than some people, because I don't want to be an anti-Mormon. As an institution and as a people, for the most part, I think the Mormon Church has a lot of benefits, and it's really helps out a lot of people. But that being said, my particular reason for leaving is not negated by the charitable acts of the church which I left. I joined as a convert. I was involved with the church, with missionary activities, pretty well involved for about a year and a half, I think. It was like a year and a half. But over the course of that time, like I suspect many people have done in this age of the internet, I couldn't escape the almost unavoidable barrage of information which any Google search would do if you looked into the history of the church, the history of that religion. And inevitably, certain things will come up which are very disturbing and constitute good reasons. My particular reasoning behind my inactivity within the church, however, was not just the troublesome history or the history of its founder, Joseph Smith, although those things did sort of act as peripheral supplements to the main reasons I left. The main reasons being, honestly, church policy on certain social issues and theological reasons, like the development of my beliefs as a person. Just saw, that is rejected many of the core things that as a Latter-day Saint you need to believe. But there's a lot that the church purposely goes out of its way, actively goes out of its way to censor when it comes to the history of its institution and its key people. Joseph Smith is probably the foremost. So much has been written negatively about Joseph Smith that it almost renders any kind of commentary on it useless, because so much this is a well studied, it's a well mined area. There were a few things which made it clear. Okay, so first of all, when you're a professing Mormon and you become a member, or when you are initiated as a child, if you were born into it, there's a certain allegiance that you have to, I mean, allegiance is like a strong word, but there's a recognition that you have to make that Joseph Smith, this guy who in the 1830s and 40s began the movement, you have to recognize him at the least as a prophet and a messenger of God, or a seer and revelator, as it's also worded, and thereby giving authority or lending authority to all of the works that Joseph Smith produced, including the Book of Mormon, translations surrounding the New Testament, a book called The Doctrine and Covenants, Pearl of Great Price. All of these different books produced and translated by Joseph Smith are the core literature of the faith, highly referenced as much as the Bible, if not more. And when you become initiated into the religion, you have to recognize Joseph Smith's prophethood. About his book, the Book of Mormon in particular, there's a lot of contention for good reason. The book basically starts as the retelling of a story of a bunch of Middle Eastern Semites, Jews? They were from the Middle East. But they were called upon by God, the Father, to get on a boat and sail to America. And their descendants, they landed in the new land. Their descendants became people that were called the Nephites, who were after a guy named Nephi. And then their opposition, the tribal opposition, so to speak, became known as the Lamanites, after their descendant named Laman. But they all began as this original group that went to the New World, allegedly. And they spread throughout the lands, spread throughout North America and South America, and that is how much of native civilization that was here pre-Columbus is explained. And that's what's believed, is that this civilization, led by these Hebrews, was what constituted the mass here on these continents. During the time of Christ, the Book of Mormon alleges, there's a shift that happens. When Jesus completes his mission in Palestine and Israel, he, in the period that he is crucified and resurrected, according to this tradition, the Mormon tradition, Jesus Christ ascends and takes himself to America, to the Americas, to deliver the gospel there and spread it among the now numerous Nephites, Lamanites. I can't really quite remember the whole timetable of this whole thing. I just know that somewhere in the neighborhood of 400 BC, correct me if I'm wrong, like, it's when they originally left the Middle East. I think it was 400 BC. But anyway, and then to the time of Christ, what we know is like year zero, whatever, is when Christ, shortly after his time in Palestine, he went to the Americas to spread the gospel here. So basically, the Lamanites and Nephites, who are all around North and South America, constant war, constant strife, empires rise and fall. They pretty much wipe out each other, and then the rest is history. And these records of this entire story the whole time, from the departure of the Middle East all the way to Christ coming, This record is what Joseph Smith claimed to reveal and discover on his property in the state of New York in the 1830s, 1820s. He found this record written by a guy named, I think it was by a guy named Mormon, was the scribe. Mormon or Moroni. But an angel reveals to him, yada yada. The problem comes with the Book of Mormon. There's a couple problems. First of all, absolutely no corroborating archaeological evidence for anything in the Book of Mormon. Not one thing. You can draw shaky, really dubious conclusions about things that have been found, like, for example, in Mexico, the Mayan and Aztec civilizations. A lot of times Mormon historians or archaeologists will try to cobble together kind of a case in that way, saying this is this location that the Book of Mormon talks about. Oh yeah, this was that city. But at best, it is dubious and speculative, and there's absolutely no proof. A good example is the Book of Mormon describes chariots and horses. It describes metal, things that were well known to not have existed, for the most part, at least in large quantities, among the native people of the Americas. So the archaeological evidence is embarrassingly scant. Of course, there's no historical evidence either, because much of native civilization that was here didn't keep historical records. I would imagine some did, but that's another thing. There's also circumstantial evidence against the idea that Joseph Smith dug up this record in his backyard in New York, in that I think it's a quarter or a third. It's a huge section of the Book of Mormon, which is completely plagiarized from the Old Testament, mostly Isaiah in the Bible. And it accounts, this plagiarism accounts for literally copying and pasting, so to speak, from the King James Version of the Bible into the Book of Mormon, word for word, or so close to word for word that it's negligibly different. That's another nail in the coffin for the Book of Mormon. There are incidental evidences where Joseph Smith, there's an example, a pretty famous example, where the dude who originally, Martin Harris, originally helped Joseph Smith to produce the manuscripts, which would become the Book of Mormon. He initially paid the publishing costs and all this stuff. His wife, Martin Harris's wife, ended up taking some of the manuscript that Joseph Smith had produced, retelling the beginning stories of the Book of Mormon, and she stole it and she hid it in her fucking drawer or something. And she challenged Joseph Smith, because she was skeptical herself, to reproduce what these parcels said, because if he really did have revelatory translation power, and he really did have a solid gold record, which is what he alleges, it's on physical gold plates that he then translates. If he really did, then he could obviously reproduce what she stole. He doesn't reproduce it, of course, and he says that the Lord revealed to him that there was another record that will be very similar to the last one, but that wouldn't be quite word for word, and he produces that. So there's incidental evidence like that, just some shady. Another thing is that, I mean, you could go on, this could be a 3-hour video. Joseph Smith, before he found the records of gold in his backyard, was convicted for fraud. And when he was a young man, he would go around to people's farm property or their homesteads, and he would offer to look for buried treasure with a magic, I think it was a magic seer stone. But he would offer these people, these property owners, give me so much money and I'll look around on your property for potential buried, like, native gold, whatever, because they were so ignorant at the time of native history. But he'd do that, and obviously he'd either find something, like perhaps planted, or a lot of times he would just scam them and run off and be like, well, I guess there wasn't anything here. So he was actually convicted in New York. I think he was in his early 20s, 20-ish, of fraud and of disorderly conduct and stuff like that in the 1820s. And then not long after that is when he claims to have found the records, kind of a buried treasure of a different kind, in his backyard in New York State. That's just the beginning of disturbing histories surrounding the founding prophet of the Mormon Church, Joseph Smith. There's things like his brazen racism that's included in the Book of Mormon, that was, I think it was actually reworded in modern translations. Book of Mormon and other places claiming that Africans were descendants of a cursed lineage. Their black skin was cursed. That racism went throughout as an official policy of the church up until like the 1970s. So it was like past the civil rights movement and really backward. But there's also Joseph Smith's polygamy. Clear records and recountings by close associates of Joseph Smith, apostles and sort of understaff beneath him who ran his church in the 1830s and 40s. There's plenteous reports of him practicing polygamy secretly with married women without the consent of their husbands even. There's instances of pedophilia when he was caught with a woman named Fanny Alger in a barn, who was like at the time 13 or 14. There's questionable issues surrounding the finances of the beginning of the church, what money was spent on, what exactly Joseph Smith was up to. So basically, in a wrap, somewhere along the line, Joseph Smith, the prophet of the Mormon Church, got into some deep shit with some people. He gained a lot of traction in the New Frontier during the 1840s when the United States was sort of going west. He gained a lot of traction, gained a lot of movement and followers, and he got himself into some deep trouble with the local authorities, the local government authorities, and which is what winded him up to being put under arrest with his brother Hiram. They were placed in jail under the authority of the government, of the U.S. government, but also an angry rioting mob surrounded the jail. There was a gunfight, there was some exchange of fire. Joseph Smith ends up being assassinated or murdered, and flies out a window and lands to his death. So it's like all the controversy surrounding him, all the problematic verses, the complete and total lack of any historical evidence. I didn't even mention the fraud of the Book of Abraham and how the Egyptian hieroglyphs that were used in that alleged translation by Joseph Smith were later proven by archaeologists who were learned in Egyptian hieroglyphs to have absolutely nothing to do, the papyri had nothing to do with what he actually wrote the papyri to say. And that Book of Abraham that he produced and translated is included in the doctrine of the Mormon Church to this day. So there's like a whole breadcrumb trail of this crap. All of that, at the end of the day, it's hard to trust something which could be produced out of so much falsehood and such a shaky foundation. And it's, I think, for that reason and for the absolute denial of the modern church to go on in depth about these topics and to try to explain it in a non-biased way, the acceptance of a flawed and terrible history, the denunciation of a prophet, even the recanting, if it's not so much to ask, of a totally non-historical and almost nonsensical work, which is sadly one of the pillars of the faith, which is the Book of Mormon. All of that combined led me out of the church doors. Actually, it's the thing that kicked my ass as I was walking out of the doors, because there, like I said, there were other theological reasons for leaving. So yeah.